All right, folks, I'm sorry I've been interrupted a couple of times for unknown technical reasons, but I'm going to try this one more time, and hopefully we won't be interrupted this time, but one can never tell. And so if you wish to join me in the panel for this discussion, you can join me at that link, and then you're going to be live online with me, and you'll be agreeing to have anything you say recorded into this live stream. Now, what I am doing is I'm reading from this book, America on the Couch by Pythia Peay, Psychological Perspectives on American Politics and Culture. And Pythia is a friend of mine who wrote this book published this book in 2015, and it contains her interviews with about 50 Jungian analysts. And so it contains a lot of very interesting perspectives. And I'm going to share those interviews with you. This particular interview is called Transforming Violence Through the Democratic Process Within and Without, an interview with Donald Kalsched, PhD. And Donald Kalsched wrote this book, Trauma and the Soul, which I like very much and highly recommend to you if you have not heard me talk about it before. I also operate a separate channel entitled Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group. So if you want to learn more about my activity, I have about 7,500 subscribers on that channel. Now, I already read the description of Donald Kalsched, which appears in this essay or in this interview. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the interview at this time. And hopefully we won't get stopped this time. I need to check from time to time. And I'm going to take my headset off, but if you join the Zoom conference, I will put my headset back on. Okay, so I'm just going to read the back and forth in this interview. Peay is Pythia Peay, and Kalsched is Donald Kalsched, the Jungian analyst. Peay, you've said that the separation of church and state written into the American Constitution was a psychologically wise decision on the part of the founders. Can you say more about what you mean by that? Kalsched, separation of church and state is foundational to American democracy and to the U.S. Constitution. This wall of separation promotes a diversity of religious expression, free of control by the state, giving people freedom to worship as they please. It also means that issues of justice will be decided within a system of secular laws and courts, not by religious authorities such as popes, rabbis, and imams. This separation between the sacred and the secular represents a huge step in the evolution of a civil society. Only a few hundred years ago in the West, there were inquisitions, holy wars, and persecutions of heretics like Galileo and Copernicus, those whose discovery that the earth orbited the sun threatened medieval Christianity. So this was a wise decision on the part of the founders because it kept religion out of the secular laws that govern people's lives. Religious beliefs were seen as an individual's personal prerogative, but those beliefs were not to become part of the way businesses were run or the way citizens conducted themselves in public, especially when it came to discriminating against people whose beliefs they didn't agree with, or as a reason to deny individuals basic human rights and privileges. So religion became a private right to believe whatever we want, but not something that leaders could use to control or dictate others' behaviors. Peay. You've also made a very unusual and interesting parallel between America's separation of church and state and the necessary and healthy separation between the ego and the unconscious realm of the psyche. Can you explain more of what you mean by that? Kalsched. Carl Jung, if you remember, added the collective layer of the unconscious to Freud's model of the psyche. He discovered that in addition to our personal unconscious, there is in each of us a much deeper layer that he called by various names, the collective unconscious or the ground plan or the objective psyche. This deeper stratum is where archetypal emotions, images, and mythical motifs and themes reside. These primitive emotions and spiritual forces are structured in antinomies. That means opposites. They tend to be experienced as opposites: love versus aggression, blissful versus horrific feelings, all good versus all bad powers, etc. The collective unconscious is also the stratum of the psyche that mediates spiritual experience. So it's easy for religious categories and attitudes to get wired up with primitive emotions, an incendiary combination. So on an individual level, our psychological health and well-being depend on a flexible boundary that separates this deeper layer of the collective unconscious within from the more limited human ego that relates these energies to the world. This boundary in the individual is analogous to the separation of church and state as a prerequisite for healthy democracy in our civic life. Peay. I can understand the importance of separation of church and state to democracy, but can you tell me why it's necessary for us as individuals to maintain this boundary between our individual ego and this deeper world of the collective unconscious? Kalsched. Because whenever our strong emotions are triggered by something, the risk is that powerful energies can come rushing up from the volcanic depths of the collective layer of the unconscious, and these energies are hard for us to hold. They tend to overwhelm us, terrify us, and we defend ourselves against this fear by a defense called dissociation. We don't metabolize the archaic energies or humanize them or consider them as we would in a healthy democracy of the psyche. We get overwhelmed by them and usually end up enacting them rather than reflecting on them or debating them as we might if we were less threatened. This is especially true if we have suffered a traumatic history, which weakens our capacities to hold and relate to powerful emotional energies. Pay. So if a democracy depends upon a system of laws to maintain the boundary between church and state, how does an individual develop a strong enough ego to handle these powerful forces from within? Kalsched. Let me give you an example. Say I'm working with a woman who has been severely abused as a child and has therefore never learned to handle strong emotions in relationships. Let's imagine that this person is very lovingly attached to me in the therapeutic alliance, but has been hurt by something I did or said. Instead of telling me about this and working it through to a better understanding, the person doesn't show up for her next appointment. When I call, she doesn't answer the phone and finally informs me via email that she's ending therapy altogether. What is going on here? Well, powerful emotions have erupted. These emotions are dual. On the one hand, vulnerable hurt and overwhelming disappointment. On the other, anger and a wish to hurt me back. On the one hand, a sense of innocence. On the other, a sense of outrage and a wish for revenge. Here, emotional extremes have taken over, and the weak ego is further weakened. An inner democracy of her psyche has been subverted by totalistic forces. She cannot talk about her hurt feelings. She can only act out her fury, thereby threatening to destroy something she loves. In a case like this, everything depends on whether we can reestablish our connection and explore the human misunderstanding that led to this impasse. If we can do this, her ego will be strengthened and the overwhelming emotional forces flooding her psyche will be humanized. We will have moved her process from a totalitarian situation to a democratic process. This process is sort of like transforming high voltage electricity from 880 volts, for example, to 220 and then 110. Such transformations always occur through the medium of relationships. In early childhood, the transformer is primarily the parental relationship, and the mother and or the father absorb and survive the child's volcanic rages, as well as the child's blissful idealizations. If this process goes well and is mostly positive, without too much trauma, then a democracy of the psyche can come about in which all the parts of the self are integrated into a whole. So what might happen in such a case? This is Peay speaking now. So what might happen in such a case? How might the 880 voltage that's taken over in her be transformed? Kalsched. Well, I might reach out to her and say something like, look, it seems clear that I've done something or said something that's terribly upset you, and I'm very sorry if that's occurred, and I'd like to make it right. Can we get together and explore it? In the subsequent conversation, my patient will have a chance to express her previously unbearable hurt, her fear of what it meant, and her outrage at what I had done. These will be parts of her that she could not witness and express before. They were not part of an inner democracy where they could coexist and maybe even understand each other. The dialogue between us will threaten her ego and lead to a clearer boundary between powerful unconscious forces and their imagery, innocent child versus monstrous therapist, and her ego. The archetypal forces will be humanized, and the world will be a place she can live in more easily and more democratically. Are you, Peay, are you referring to a kind of inner democracy? Kalsched. Yes, inner and outer democracies seem to go together. The inner tolerance for the different parts of ourselves seems to parallel how tolerant we can be to the otherness of different people or different lifestyles. In a healthy, resilient psyche, this means that all the different parts of a person, from the weakest to the strongest, are equal and have a place at the table. This fulfills what Jung believed was the psyche's strongest striving, wholeness. Just as the healthy psyche welcomes all the parts of itself at the table, so a healthy democracy includes all of the different groups, organizations, ethnicities, and political points of view at the banquet table. A democracy that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. This imagery of wholeness is part of our national seal on the back of the dollar bill. A banner in the beak of the eagle says, E pluribus unum, or from the many, one. At some level, I think we all feel this longing for inclusion and wholeness in the culture, and how moving it is when the disenfranchised are included in the political process. The election of our first Black president, for example, was tremendously exciting in that regard. In the traumatized, fear-ridden psyche, however, democracy is compromised and we get totalitarianism. In a trauma psychology, the vulnerable parts of the self are exiled and a survivor self is installed. This means that one part of the psyche takes over in the interest of survival rather than in the interest of relationship and wholeness, just as in my clinical example. On a political level, you can see that this operating in third world countries where there's a trauma history and a trauma psychology leading to a takeover of the people by tyrannical forces. Peay. So if I understand you, developing tolerance is key to democracy, both in accepting all the parts of oneself and as it functions in a democracy to respect and tolerate the beliefs of others. Kalsched, right. But this form of secular democracy can't happen unless people are willing to sacrifice their egos for the rule of a larger reality, which is called the rule of law, fashioned and agreed to by the people. Psychologically and developmentally speaking, the subordination of the ego to the rule of consensually established laws is a huge sacrifice of the self-appointed superiority or divine prerogatives once claimed by kings and emperors. Recall that as recently as 1945, the Emperor of Japan was understood to be divine. We see the same effort to enshrine religious rule and rulers in the caliphate that ISIS wants to establish in Iraq and Syria. In other words, the descent from on high into democracy, demos meaning the people and kratos meaning power. Power to the people requires a disidentification from spiritual powers. Once we're in a democracy, we're free to relate to divine energies, but we're no longer allowed to identify with them or arrogate their power to our ego in a way that gives us power over others. Naturally, many resist giving up their superiority. Before the American Civil War, white men thought themselves to be superior to blacks and to women. Tolerance of others is a difficult achievement psychologically, and democracy is slow and painful too. And we need to remind ourselves how much sacrifice of our godly superiority is necessary to fully embrace it. Peay. So what happens on a psychological level to a secular democracy when the boundary between church and state breaks down? What would be some examples of that breakdown, and where are we today with that struggle? Kalsched. Throughout America's history, that separation between church and state has been threatened at every turn. One of the most well-known examples was the 1925 Scopes trial on whether to allow the scientific theory of evolution to be taught in public schools because it threatened biblical beliefs. Some states are still having that debate around whether evolution should be taught. I think that we're witnessing a creeping loss of that separation between church and state, a kind of politicization of religious beliefs, where we find religious fervor and terminology leaking into our common language and public debates. Recently, the state of Arizona barely defeated a law that was going to allow businesses and shopkeepers to refuse service to gay people because they felt it violated their religious beliefs condemning homosexuality. Extremist opponents of abortion, for example, feel that they know what's right and what's wrong and where innocence and guilt lies, which they feel gives them the right to murder abortion doctors to protect the innocence of unborn babies. But the people who protect the innocence of unborn babies don't seem to realize that there's innocence in the doctors who have been vilified and in the women who have struggled with the horrific decision to end their pregnancies as well. Instead, they see abortion as split into black and white categories of good and evil, right and wrong. In fact, it is a terribly complicated issue, made all the more so by how much more we know today about intrauterine life. I understand and have sympathy with why people are concerned about protecting life growing in utero. I also have great sympathy for the women who have decided to end their pregnancies. There are no easy answers here, but we can't explore these complexities because of the polarizing categories and language in which the debate is framed. Welcome, Sean. I'm reading from America on the Couch by Pythia Peay. I'm reading an interview with Donald Kalsched. Right. Righto. Sean says, strength without boundaries becomes violence and is often associated with the good intention becoming evil. The United States is no different if they don't take precautions in chaos. That would be my criticism of Trump because he is not sophisticated enough for diplomacy. Speaking of war, part of democracy, right? So the president doesn't give his opponents room to breathe, and that doesn't work well. Pay. So does religion spilling over into our public debates exacerbate political polarization? Kalsched. I think so. Psychologically, this is because these emotional spiritual powers and collective archetypes that I've been describing are each made up of two opposing poles, binary extremes, totalistic categories. When they take over the conversation, human dialogue ends. Feelings and opinions are all screened through the lens of right versus wrong, good versus evil, believer versus infidel. Otherwise, reasonable people turn into extremists. We see dramatic examples of this in the Middle East today. Journalists who defend the right to different opinions are being beheaded. But lesser examples are apparent in our American Congress, where we almost never hear someone admit that the other side has a point of view or an idea that's worth listening to. Pay. So with the erosion of the boundary between church and state comes the danger of intolerance for the other and other points of view and ways of being. Then we're left with a split, angry, polarized country instead of a healthy democracy. Kalsched, right. The capacity to hold conflict is a huge accomplishment by democratic cultures. That's why I believe in them so much. A democracy enshrines conflict as the very source of its energy. Pay. What a profoundly American idea to welcome back into political life. The Constitutional Convention was an exemplification of what you said. All the founders coming together with their opposing religious beliefs and philosophical principles, yet somehow finding a way to transcend those differences to create the Constitution. What's happened in America that we can't sustain conflicting viewpoints anymore? I'll read that question again. What's happened to America that we can't sustain conflicting viewpoints anymore? Kalsched. I'll begin to answer that by describing how psychologists work with individuals who can't sustain conflict in a healthy way. In psychology, for example, we talk about a dissociation psychology, which is part of a larger trauma psychology. Dissociation is a splitting off from an experience that a person can't bear to feel, and the installing of a defensive structure in order to survive. The example I gave earlier is a case in point. Just as in that example, in my clinical work, I'm always trying to help a person who suffered a trauma move from the defensive posture of a dissociative psychology to a conflict psychology. In this work, the traumatized person learns how to feel the feelings that they don't want to feel, including the hatred that they have for their own vulnerability. We teach them how to witness their vulnerability with an observing ego, a part of them that can say to someone they're in conflict with, I felt hurt when you said that, rather than hitting the offending person in the face or insulting them back or putting the shame they feel inside that person because they can't bear to feel it in themselves. In other words, they're trying to help those who, in other words, we're trying to help those who've been traumatized to become big enough to tolerate difficult emotions and provide enough capacity to hold conflicting feelings so that they can relate to another person even in the storm of emotion without dissociating. Pay. So are you saying that the American psyche is suffering from a trauma? I have to wonder if 9/11 damaged the American psyche, wounding this whole democratic experiment and genius around being able to hold conflict. Kalsched. I think the American psyche is indeed suffering from the effects of trauma, and 9/11 is certainly a part of that, even though the full story is more complicated. With respect to that fateful day, if you'll remember, we went through a process. In the first 3 weeks, there was an incredible outpouring of compassion toward America from around the world. Initially, even President Bush took the courageous stand that the terrorist attacks had nothing to do with the Muslim religion, but with radicals who were misusing the Muslim religion in the service of terrorism. This was a statement that helped to hold a healthy conflict atmosphere. Bush even said that we were hurting as a country. Unfortunately, he rapidly shifted from that to shock and awe and the invasion of Iraq. And as soon as that retributive justice came into play, we're going to hunt you down and get even with you. America entered into a dissociative trauma psychology. Then we split into opposites in which we were the righteous victims and they the evil perpetrators. At that point, we stopped asking questions like, why did they do this? Who was behind this? And what must have been going on in the psyches of these people? What kind of distorted psychology and way of thinking led to this act? Those kinds of questions are those kinds of questions were rarely asked. Only our remaining concern was how to wipe out our enemies most efficiently. Peay. 12 years later, where do you feel we are as a country in handling the trauma we sustained from 9/11? From what you're saying, it sounds like we've regressed as a democracy. Kalsched. The acute trauma has come off the American psyche. I don't think we feel as imperiled now by fear. Some of that is due to the fact that we've instituted enough defensive procedures that we've made ourselves more secure. But this security has been gained at the huge price of our personal privacy. This puts us in danger of regressing back to an archaic primitive, fundamentalist mindset. If that happens, democracy withers and is replaced by totalistic rhetoric. One of the things that 9/11 brought home to us was how vulnerable we are in the modern world to individual evildoers who can cause us harm from a distance because their power is amplified by modern technology. In today's digitally wired world, one hacker can bring down a whole computer system. One suicide bomber can blow up a whole city. This is unprecedented in human history, and it justifiably fills us with fear. But if the power to harm is amplified by technology, so it is further amplified by religious fanaticism. The binding power of human community fails, and sheer anarchy is loosed upon the world. So I believe that what used to be an acute trauma in the American psyche following 9/11 has now become chronic and has found its way into a traumatized mindset in the American people. We're living in a post-traumatic world with real threats from extremists. We're suffering from chronic PTSD, and we get triggered very easily. Peay. You mean like a hypersensitive, hypervigilant person would be to any kind of perceived slight or threat? Sean says, the spilled blood in Iraq by sacrifices won a meaning which demanded more blood. It reminds me of my essay, yes, absolutely. There will be blood. The blood becomes vein in the collective psyche. Sometimes it takes blood to change people's minds, unfortunately. I'll read Pythia's question again. Peay. You mean like a hypersensitive, hypervigilant person would be to any kind of perceived slight or threat? Kalsched. An example of individual hypersensitivity is what happened in Jacksonville, Florida, where Michael Dunn had an altercation with a group of black kids in a car, then thought he saw a shotgun pointed at him, so he emptied 10 rounds into their SUV, killing the unarmed 19-year-old Jordan Davis. Or like the National Rifle Association following the Newtown massacre, suggesting that an armed society is a polite society and that for every bad guy with a gun, there should be a good guy with a gun. This form of absolutist, totalistic thinking that eliminates the middle ground is an example of a regression in our political life to a more primitive psychology. A primitive psychology, by the way, which is extremely seductive and addictive, and that pulls us all into it. The fact that nobody has identified the fear element at the core of the NRA is a sign of how a psychological perspective on current events has failed to help us in our understanding. Just a moment. Okay, I'm reading from America on the Couch by Pythia Peay. I'm reading an interview with Donald Kalsched, who's a union analyst in Arizona. Peay: identifying fear as motivating the NRA isn't something I've heard talk much about or would even associate with that organization. Kalsched: let's face it, after Newtown, we were all terrified, and we were all grasping for ways to defend ourselves against such a horrific threat. The whole raison d'etre of the NRA is defense against real and imagined dangers. So one can readily see how much fear lives at the core of their organization. A fear psychology and its totalistic mindset is at the heart of the NRA. For example, when they say things like, they're going to take our guns away from us, this makes any reasonable discussion of gun control impossible because the NRA has already vilified those who oppose its policies out of fear. It is hard to reach a realistic understanding of danger from within such a polarizing mindset. It is hard to reach a realistic understanding of danger from within such a polarizing mindset. Peay: this brings us to Adam Lanza and to the horrific 2012 massacre at Newtown Elementary School. Lanza seems a clear example of someone who lost his conscious footing, so to speak, and was overtaken by those primitive and archaic titanic powers of the collective unconscious you've been describing. Like all the other young men involved in mass shootings, he was described as a psychopathic killer. Kalsched: what united us all after this tragedy was not What united us all after this tragedy was our shared horror. The slaughter of the innocents, to use the biblical phrase, Matthew 2:13-23, is a terrible thing to behold. It mobilized our deep compassion for the victims and our outrage that something like that could have happened. Although this outrage is understandable, it needs to be channeled into constructive action. But then the conversation quickly broke down into a polarized split between innocence and evil. Someone like Adam Lanza was seen as a psychotic killer who should be killed if necessary. So then the solution is that if someone like Adam Lanza has arms, all citizens should be armed. Now, a gun is archetypal energy put into the hands of humans. It gives a person the power to kill in an instant and at a distance. And if we arm everybody, then we've now put archetypal powers in the hands of everybody. In a democracy, these archetypal powers are supposed to be vested in a police force under civilian control. Again, I think it comes back to the question of human relatedness and its civilizing power. How do we bring those moderating forces into a situation that terrorizes and polarizes us? For example, do we have the courage to look at the complexity of Lanza's situation? He was more than a psychotic predator. Peay: then what was he? Kalsched: he was a confused, lost, and very disturbed kid. He had a story of his own trauma, neglect, and marginalization, but he was so alienated and mentally ill that he couldn't tell it. He could only act it out. Peay: Well, the mother was very present and the father was concerned, although it sounds like both parents didn't know what to do with him. Kalsched, right. I'm sure the parents didn't know how to reach their son. Sometimes we're unprepared for the amount of violence that comes up in our children. They thought getting their troubled son a gun and taking him to a shooting range would help. Obviously, it didn't. Pay. What you say makes me think that as a culture, we don't know the first thing about handling violence. Read that again. What you say makes me think that as a culture, we don't know the first thing about handling violence. Kalsched, I think that's right. It's a terribly difficult thing to learn how to handle violence in a related way. It's really hard because violence frightens us and heightens our defenses. So it's very easy to dissociate from the violence in our kids, in ourselves, and in our parents. Consequently, it doesn't get transformed. It stays at 880 volts instead of being transformed to a more usable 220 or 110 volts. Pay. So it's as if we have this high voltage power floating around in the cultural atmosphere, a very dangerous psychic energy that affects everybody. Kalsched, very dangerous, especially when it gets hooked up to innocence. Pay, what do you mean by that? Kalsched, well, we all like to think of ourselves as good and relatively innocent. It seems to me that this tendency is especially strong in the American character. We like to think of ourselves as good guys. We vanquished the bad guys many times in our history, and look at the violent power we have developed and used over our history. We almost extinguished the Aboriginal peoples on this continent, justifying our actions because they were savages. In World War II, we rescued Europe and became the shining city on the hill. We don't think we have much badness in it. It's in our American soul that we will defend ourselves with guns or whatever we need, atomic weapons, because we tend to be pretty identified with our innocence and goodness. Pay. Well, we do have badness in us, but we just don't think we do. Kalsched. We don't like to think about it, but of course we do. It's part of human nature. As individual persons, we all struggle with our own darkness and destructiveness, but this inner battle is harder to admit on a collective national level. And the ones who do think about it or point it out are often branded traitors and betrayers of the American ideal. The idea that good can be found within one's antagonist is really hard to maintain psychologically, but it's part and parcel with the developmental achievement of democracy. When we lose this awareness, we lose democracy. Look at the people across history who have held that ideal, who have held the idea that good can be found within one's antagonist. They are the peacemakers, people like Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Anwar Sadat, and Abraham Lincoln. All but Mandela were assassinated by extremists who were threatened by the idea of getting so close to the enemy. Abraham Lincoln is by paradigmic and quintessential Democrat. Abraham Lincoln is my paradigmic and quintessential Democrat. Lincoln didn't claim that the North was innocent and that the South was evil because they had slavery. He didn't make the South pay for the North's victory. Lincoln was amazing in his ability to hold the opposites together, both outwardly and in his own inner world, and yet he suffered terribly. So to me, Lincoln was the quintessential American who held together the opposites in his own life, and for that, he was assassinated. Pay. So conceivably, the inner work we could aim to do as individuals around a kind of inner inclusiveness, knowing and accepting all sides of ourselves, good, bad, weak, strong, and in between, could be a model for the psychological work we do on an outer level in politics. In that way, the inner and outer work of democracy could conceivably nurture each other. Kalsched, absolutely. In today's politics, what we see are politicians and citizens taking the path of least resistance toward bringing these polarized extremes. It's really a form of psychological laziness because democracy takes hard work, sacrifice, because democracy takes hard work, sacrifice, energy, and time to understand the other person's point of view. Instead, we see people reverting to sloganeering and demagoguery. We rarely hear any kind of nuanced discussion of issues because it's so apparently hard to listen to each other. It's easier to slip into a polarized argument, and the media love it. A good fight is always sensational and increases ratings, but this is a function of a dissociative psyche, which in itself is a function of a traumatized psychology in the culture. So at a political level, the inner work we do around accepting the uncomfortable, shadow sides of our own psyches would correspond to something like public conversations, planned debates, and open dialogues that involve real listening between Republicans and Democrats. As I said earlier, what we as psychologists see is that healthy psyche tolerates differences within the self and makes room at the table for its full range of feelings. That's not only at the core of a healthy psyche, it's at the core of a healthy democracy. I don't agree with you, but I don't agree. So that's not only at the core of a healthy psyche, it's at the core of a healthy democracy. Quote, I don't agree with you, but you're at the table and you have as much right here as I do. So we're going to debate and hash out our differences and try to find some common ground, if only the common ground of our humanity, unquote. The human realities that bond us and pull us together as people have to be cultivated. We've all suffered the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. We're all mortal, and life is fleeting, fragile, and impermanent. Why can't we continue to suffer the human condition together? E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That's the precious legacy of democracy, within and without. It seems especially endangered in our time, but well worth fighting for. So that's the end of that interview. I've been reading an essay from America on the Couch by Pythia Peay. It's actually an interview between Pythia Peay and Donald Kalsched entitled Transforming Violence Through the Democratic Process Within and Without. And I will probably be reading more of the essays in this book over the next few weeks. And so Sean says, trying to get back to, Sean says, alpha waves in the human brain are between 6 and 8 hertz. The wave frequency of the human cavity resonates between 6 and 8 hertz. all biological systems operate in the same frequency. The human brain's alpha waves function in this range, and the electrical resonance of the Earth is between 6 and 8 hertz. Thus, our entire biological system, the brain and the Earth itself, work on the same frequencies. If we can control that resonant system electronically, we can directly control the entire mental system of humankind. That was quoted from Nikola Tesla. What happens if something happens to the human psyche? I think Jung posed that question. Well, that is a question, and obviously 9/11 is a great example of what happens to the human psyche. When the human psyche has trauma, as we did at 9/11, as a country, then we go into defensive mode and we aren't living the best life that we could. And that's the unique thing about the United States. So anyway, thank you for joining me today. I'm in the process of putting some good material here in this political psychology channel, and I hope you found that interesting today. I certainly did. I thought I thought both Pythia's questions and Dr. Kalsched's answers were very appropriate to us for thinking about all of the time since 9/11. And I think it's very interesting that Pythia is the name of the Delphic oracle. And so this was the name that Pythia's father gave her, and it's a very interesting name. So anyway, thanks for being here today, and I'll see you again on one of my 2 channels that I'm actively operating these days.